So before we get into the last couple of verses of chapter 2, let's again just look back and see where we came from. Last week we finished up all of the interactions in the field. Remember, we went over, hey, there's this nice little chiastic structure. We finished up all of those interactions. We ended up with Boaz talking to his workers again and saying, hey, make sure that really you treat Ruth well no matter what she's doing. Go ahead and take some of that grain and just throw it to the floor, man. He's just making sure that Ruth is going to be protected and that she's going to be provided for. She's not going to be ashamed. She's not going to go away empty-handed. So let's set that in context here. The beginning of chapter 2 started off with Naomi and Ruth interacting. Ruth is asking Naomi for permission to go and work in the fields. Verse 3, Ruth actually goes out into the field. And now, today, we're going to finish off the great chiasm here. Woo-hoo, look at all of these parallel colors. Doesn't that just make you feel happy? It makes me feel happy. So we're going to finish off with, again, Ruth's actions and then a closing interaction between Ruth and Naomi. And you guys may notice that this all points again to that central idea, that central theme of Boaz praying for Ruth, praying protection and provision, and that the Lord would bless her. And again, we talked about how the whole chapter hinges around that idea, that it's all really about that. So again, we're going to finish that off as we dive in today. So go ahead and pull out your Bible. If you put it away, pull it on out. Unless you want to follow along on the screen and try to sort through all the colors, that's fine too. Let's go ahead and read Ruth chapter 2, and we'll start with verses 17 and 18. So she, Ruth, gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. There's a lot here, so let's start at the very top. After she has had this interaction with Boaz, she returns to the field and she keeps on working all the way until evening. Now, I was curious, and is this typical? Would they have normally worked till evening, or was she really pushing it to the max and saying, I am just going to stay out until sunset, boo to the ya? It was actually surprisingly difficult to find an answer to this question. Google was not very helpful, nor was my Bible software. Essentially, what I ended up sort of finding is that it was going to be typical, especially for this time period and this time of the year, harvest, for them to just go crazy and work nonstop, making sure that they got all of that harvest in. You don't want to lose it to weather. You don't want to lose it to pests. You want to be able to get it in. Somebody from our morning group commented that even today, farmers will still, whenever it's harvest time, you pull out all the stops and you get that harvest in. So this wouldn't have been necessarily abnormal for her to work until evening. Sun up to sundown was kind of typical. There were some commentators who said that maybe Boaz would normally have called a little bit of an earlier day, perhaps to allow his workers time for reading and study. That was based off of off of the Talmud, which is a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. This is pretty early in biblical history, and the Talmud came a lot later. So I'm not sure necessarily that would have been the case. We know, of course, that Boaz was a God-honoring man, but that harvest was really, really important. Regardless, they had a long day, all right? They had a long day, and Ruth worked that entire time. Again, long day. I had a 12-hour day the other day working for subbing and then at Starbucks, and I was not happy by the evening. I will just say 12-hour days are not my thing, all right? So Ruth is doing this hard labor out in the field. She's gleaning, following behind Boaz's woman. And then it's evening, and now she beats out or threshes what she's gleaned. Let's pause for a moment and just talk about threshing. So basically, whenever you gather up all of the barley or the grain, it comes in this little protective coat. And it's great. It protects the little kernel of goodness, but it's not edible. So you have to separate the chaff, that outer layer, from the kernel of barley or wheat. So there were a whole bunch of different methods that they would use for doing this. If you had means, you would hitch up some oxen to a big giant stone thing and have the oxen drag it, and it would pull it all to pieces. Ruth probably didn't have that option available to her. In this picture, you see a guy with a winnowing fork tossing the barley or the grain up into the air, and it'll separate as it falls down. Often, and you see too that this guy's holding some type of big heavy thing to be able to smack it down with. If you didn't have any other means of being able to separate out the barley, a stick or a stone would work pretty well, and people would just sit down and sort of beat it out. That worked too. Yeah.
Floor. They had a threshing floor.
They did. Yep.
A circle thing.
Yep. And so the threshing floor, which we'll reference again later on in chapter 3, wasn't necessarily anything. It's not a building. It's not an indoor location. It's just a big flat space that they would have cleared out, usually on a hilltop, so that the wind could blow the chaff away, and they would carry all the grain to that spot and then smash it all out. Can I just say that I am super glad that I live in the 21st century and I do not have to beat my grain for my oatmeal. Because, gosh, that's a lot of work for some oatmeal. It's a lot.
But there's somewhere in the Bible
you would earn it.
They were hiding in the threshing floor from their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's in Samson.
Gideon. Yeah,
So
Gideon.
it might have been had a wall around it, but they still threw it up in the air so that the grain would stay in one place.
Yeah, or you can, they can make it slightly more advanced so that they can have higher walls. But, they wanted it to be open so that the wind could blow it out. So it couldn't be completely enclosed.
The grain would stay.
So
if they had a wall, the grain would stay and wouldn't blow away.
yeah, as you see here, they have the side sort of mounded up a little bit. So, yeah. So again, Ruth is threshing. She manages to knock all the grain off. She's not content. She just carry the stuff home. Well, first of all, it would have been hard to because that's sort of bulky there. Let's continue looking back here. How much did she beat out? It was about an ephah of barley. So there's some discussion about exactly how much was this. Commentator, depending on the measurements at the time, it could have been anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds.
Wow.
Which is, regardless, a very large amount. A lot of commentators said that it was at least twice what you would normally expect to gather from a day of bleeding. At least twice. Maybe more, but at least twice. And I don't know how many of you guys have ever been like...
As a foreigner or just a normal gleaning
A normal.
person?
No more gleaning. Yep. Because different, even though it was different cultures, it was an agricultural society in general. So they would have all been at least relatively familiar with going out and doing hard work. And it was a very different time. I'm like, this is all foreign to me. I'm the foreigner to this society more than even Ruth is. But I don't know how many of you guys have ever gone backpacking or even on a hike. And I don't know about you guys, but whenever I go on a backpack, like 20 pounds, that's a lot, but that's kind of manageable. Whenever I get close to 30 pounds, oh no. Or have you ever been to the airport and like they have a 50-pound cutoff and you're like, I'm super light, and you're like trying to lift it onto the scale? That's a lot of weight, all right? And so regardless of like what it exactly was, that was a lot of barley. And Ruth takes it up and carries it back into the city, back up the hill, back to her home with Naomi, which is pretty crazy. Also, a lot of commentators said that what she gathered, depending again on exactly how much she gathered, could have been anywhere from a week to 2 weeks worth of provisions for the two women. So this was big deal, big deal. So Ruth grabs all of that along with her leftovers. She's got a little leftover bag or something, and she carries it back to Naomi. And this is great too, because it doesn't say, and Ruth got really hungry on the way home, so she just, scarfed the rest of the leftovers and then, no. She saved it for Naomi. Anybody have any questions so far on this whole section?
If she worked that hard and it was that late, Naomi wouldn't have time to cook it, and really have a meal.
That's true. Yep. So,
'Cause it
again,
takes a
Ruth
long
is
time to
being
cook barley.
considerate. Yep. Good. So let's continue forward. Let's go ahead and read the first part of verse 19 here. So let's see Naomi's reaction. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So first of all, Naomi's reaction tells us that what Ruth brought home is way crazy. It is, and we know from, the resources that we have that what she brought home was crazy. But Naomi's reaction is like, whoa, first of all, you have leftovers. You have leftovers? From what? How did you get food? What is going on? And then just the pure amount that she brought home was above and beyond amazing. So Naomi's just astounded here. The second thing that Naomi's reaction tells us is this is a really cool rhetorical device that we're going to see expanded upon in the second half of the verse that the author is using. And that he has her repeat the question. Where did you glean today? Where have you worked? And she's asking where, not in whose field. All of these things together are slowing down the narrative and purposefully just sort of making us take a step back and sort of huddle up in anticipation, because we know whose field they worked in. We know it was Boaz, but the author's just slowing it down. Where did you work today? And we're just sort of like, it's Boaz, oh my gosh, it's Boaz. But again, the author's just slowing it down here. Now, Kelly Minter made a point in the book to say that Naomi isn't asking the right question here, that she's not thinking about the who, she's thinking about where. But she is clearly thinking about the who. Because she says, blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she's thinking about the who. It's not that she's asking the wrong question. It's a deliberate attempt on the part of the author of the book of Ruth, again, to just build up the anticipation here. One more thing before we continue on. The phrase took notice of is the exact same phrase that Ruth uses when she's speaking to Boaz. And she says, why have you taken notice of me? I'm a foreigner. And we remember last week we said that took notice of and foreigner have the same root word in Hebrew. And it's that idea of to look into something and that is unknown is take notice of, and foreigner is unknown. And so we have the same phrase here. Just interesting. No major theological connection here, but it's interesting that there is that connection. Let's press forward to the rest of the verse here. So she, being Ruth, told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Finally, Boaz. But again, you notice that there's this redundant phrasing that is, again, slowing that narrative down, drawing out, building that suspension, so that whenever you finally get to Boaz, you're like, finally, oh my gosh, you couldn't have just said, look, I worked with this guy Boaz. He was great. Because we know that Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. We know that. Ruth doesn't know that, and Naomi doesn't know that Boaz is the one who is in the field. So we as the readers are just, again, there's just anticipation building, and now finally we know it's Boaz. Questions so far? Yes, ma'am.
So, if Naomi knew that he was their kinsman redeemer,
Mm-hmm.
why didn't she say a while ago to Ruth, hey, our kinsman redeemer is Boaz, let's go see if he can help us out?
Yep. So, and we'll get into the deep down dive into that a little bit later whenever we get to chapter 3, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Some commentators suggested that Naomi was hoping that Boaz would act first. There are also, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but the kinsman redeemer doesn't have any marriage obligations. So there wasn't necessarily a expectation of Boaz or the other guy, who's a closer kinsman redeemer, to do anything marital related to Naomi or Ruth. There are other aspects, but not that.
We were
So
trying to figure out if Naomi's husband and the father of Boaz and that other man
Your
were.
brothers.
there's possibilities. It's possible.
They don't remember.
We don't know. We know that there was another dude who was more closely related than Boaz. We don't know what exactly the relationship was. So it's a good question, but we don't know.
Doesn't tell you.
You know, they could have went to him for just food. Like,
Yeah.
you know, they were pretty destitute when they got there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, our culture treats shame in sort of interesting ways. We tend to, in this culture, very much not shame people for anything, except for all the wrong things. But so, you know, we have, hey, you know, you can't make a comment about anything, otherwise you're called, oh, well, you're being, pick your phobic, you know. So shame in this culture was much more of a thing. And so for, again, we thought about, you know, well, why didn't Naomi herself go into the field? Well, maybe she was ashamed. Cindy,
It's probably too old.
maybe.
Maybe
Cindy.
Naomi also didn't think about Boaz or the other kinsman redeemer, which we don't
Mhm.
really ever know who he is, because at that point she really wasn't in the right frame of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
she was not.
Well, and she'd be asking them to marry a Moabite. Like, she's not presenting a pretty Jewish little girl that would be here or whatever. She's
Right.
presenting a foreigner.
But it's not. Yeah, like you said, it's not.
You
But
don't
I
have
think
to.
they're responsible for taking care of them, not necessarily.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Right.
saying. Just taking
marrying
care.
them,
Yeah.
Not necessarily
I
marrying.
believe that was.
Yes.
the way I read that.
Yeah. Yep. And so there's, at this point, as far as we're aware, Naomi still has possession of the land, or has at least access to the land because she's going to sell it, is what Boaz says in chapter 4. And so there's not necessarily at this moment an obligation anywhere for anybody to necessarily really do anything. Because, again, in a moment we'll review the full list of what the kinsman redeemer does, and we're going to see that at the time, like, there's possibilities, but is there anything definite? It's sort of a little bit murky. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So hold on to that, pull it back out in a couple of seconds. We're about to dive into that whole thing.
Okay.
Anybody else on this slide? Yes, ma'am.
One question. So Naomi asks where twice,
Mm-hmm.
and then Ruth answers with whom twice. So it's not really like
Yep. Correct.
answering the question.
Correct.
Well, remember though, Naomi also said, blessed be the man, so she did
Yeah.
say man.
Right.
So she did bring up the guy,
Yep.
you know what I mean?
The other-
Yeah, so
the
it's
other-
not a total leap. It's just interest. It's
The
other-
I just wonder if there's a reason why.
I thought when she didn't say that Naomi asked the wrong question. I thought she said that Ruth answered the wrong question. Like Ruth was all excited. Naomi said where, and Naomi was. Naomi said where,
Mhm.
and Ruth was so excited. I worked with this
Right.
guy Boaz.
Right.
So she was excited about him, and she asked who, not
Right.
where.
I think that, I mean, ultimately, there are two things in play here. First of all, again, there's this idea that we're slowing down the narrative, that we're really trying to draw attention to the fact that it is Boaz, and starting off with asking where, not who, does draw attention to that. But the other thing to consider is that, remember what we said about the location of the field and how there's the city and then there's the field surrounding the city. And so for you to identify where you worked, obviously it's in the field, but what portion of the field is Boaz's field?
Yeah.
'Cause she
So you
wouldn't
have to name a name.
necessarily met the owner of that.
Right.
Those stones in between.
Right, and so, I mean, all right, so you take the third palm tree down and then, you cross over, so, I mean, you have to use some names in order to describe, what the location is, if possible, because you may not have known, but she knew, so she could say, oh, it was Boaz's field. So, any other questions? Some good thinking going down. Great. So, let's read verse 20. Naomi reacts again. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So, first of all, I do want to point out that in the last verse, whenever Naomi blesses this man who has taken care of Ruth, she doesn't say, may the Lord bless him. She just say, may he be blessed. She just says, may he be blessed. It is only now, after the mention of Boaz, that she directly invokes the name of the Lord. It's very interesting. So let's dive into this. We're going to sort of address this in reverse order. We're going to zero in on the second half of this first because it really opens up her blessing. Why was she so excited about Boaz? And we know. But let's really dive into that. What is a kinsman redeemer? Let's really, really break it down. Kinsman is just a relative. And then redeem is the idea of buying back. So something's been sold, something's been lost, and you're buying it back. Kelly Minter did a really good job, I thought, laying out the full sort of gambit of what a kinsman redeemer is. If you guys want to, if it helps you to turn in your books to it, in the Kelly Minter book, it's on pages 85 and 86. It will be on the screen as well, but if it helps you to sort of jot notes down, we're just going to briefly recap what a kinsman redeemer does. One of their purposes is, of course, to ensure that the hereditary property of the clan doesn't pass outside the clan. God had established that within the tribes, certain clans got different sections of land, and it was his intent that those would stay within those tribes. And so we have things like the year of Jubilee that's set up so that, hey, every 50 years, doesn't matter what debts you have on the land, everybody's free, go back to your original owners. If you're a slave, you get to be free. There shouldn't be any generational poverty. So this is one of, the kinsman redeemer is one of the things set up in the law to prevent generational poverty. So let's continue looking through here. Number 2, to maintain the freedom of individuals of the clan by buying back those who had sold themselves into slavery because of poverty. Again, if the year of Jubilee was last year and you just had to sell yourself into slavery this year, it would really kind of stink to be in slavery for the next 49 years. So the kinsman redeemer, one of the things they could do was buy you back out of that slavery, essentially pay your debt, so that you could go back and be free. Number 3, this one always, I don't know why I have a morbid spirit, but it kind of always makes me chuckle. To track down and execute murderers of near relations. So if, you got offed, then your kinsman redeemer would go track down the person who killed you and off them. So I don't know why I always snicker whenever I talk about this, because it's not funny, but it kind of is. This one's also kind of funny, but it's to receive restitution money on behalf of a deceased victim of a crime. So in Old Testament times, restitution was a really, really, really big deal. If you, knocked somebody's eye out, you had to pay restitution. If you killed somebody's lamb, had to pay restitution. If you accidentally killed somebody, you had to pay restitution. But the person who was mainly wronged is unfortunately no longer living to be able to receive that restitution. But you still had to pay it. So the kinsman redeemer would receive that restitution on your behalf. Finally, the kinsman redeemer was supposed to ensure that justice was being served, again, on your behalf if you were involved in some sort of lawsuit and there were parties involved and you wanted to make sure that it was all squared away fairly. Kinsman redeemers would sort of oversee that process. So notice, again, that nowhere in here is anything about marriage. The whole marriage thing is the levirate marriage, where a brother-in-law would, if Joe dies, then Joe's brother marries Joe's widow, so that the line can perpetuate. And again, think back to chapter 1, where Naomi says, "Do I have any other sons to give to you?" No. So that was referencing the whole levirate marriage, where if she had had other sons, she would have given them to Orpah and to Ruth, but she didn't. And so they were screwed. So,
So does that mean that the marital thing was really only if it was a very, very close
brother?
It had to be the
Brother. Yeah. Just brothers. Yep. So there's no marital obligation here on Boaz or on any other relative. But we do have all the stuff about buying back. So if Naomi and Ruth are in the direst of straits and they have to, either try to get their land back if they've already sort of lent it out, or if they're in the process of trying to, make sure that they don't go into that, having a kinsman redeemer is going to be a big deal. Now, Naomi, as we know later on in the beginning of chapter 3, is actually thinking, oh my gosh, one of these, look, we can get Boaz and Ruth together, and oh my gosh, yes. So she has already put all of these things together inside her mind. As soon as she hears Boaz, she's like, oh my gosh, this is from the Lord. And so, all of the marbles come together, all of the threads come together in her mind, and she has created a narrative, which is actually going to come true. I mean, don't we all do this? Sometimes we paint these crazy, we're like, oh my gosh, and this means that has to happen, and I have to go here because this is going to happen, and it's all going to come true. Yeah. And that's not always the case, but of course we know that in this case, it was. And Naomi here is really, really interesting. She is finally coming to a recognition that, contrary to how she felt at the end of chapter 1, that the Lord indeed has been with her, and he has not forsaken her. Now, let's look at this again. Let's look at the first half. May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Now, let's first of all look at this highlighted word, kindness. Okay, maybe throw up a hand and tell me. Sorry, that's a holdover from teaching the little kids. Can you throw up a hand and tell me? Kindness. What's the Hebrew word that we've been talking about throughout these weeks that kindness is translated from, but it's not really a great translated word? Or can you tell me what the word perhaps is better translated into? Does anybody remember? Yes! Yes! Hesed, which is that loyal, loving kindness. It's that stick to it through all circumstances, God's loyal love. And again, it's used most often of the Lord. Now, there's some debate over exactly who is being referenced here. Is it actually the Lord, or is it Boaz? Is Naomi saying, Boaz's kindness hasn't forsaken the living or dead, or is it the Lord's loving kindness hasn't forsaken the living or the dead? To me, having it reference the Lord makes a lot more sense. It just seems to really line up with the overall sort of flow that we've been tracking Naomi's faith journey. And in a moment, we're going to throw up on the screen a comparison of a couple of statements that she said. And it just seems to make more sense in talking about the Lord. But again, some people say, no, it's talking about Boaz. If you land there, again, we're not going to cast you out into the utter darkness and gnashing of teeth. But it does seem to be the Lord here. So that's what we're going to roll with as we continue to talk about these verses. Now, again, let's rewind just a little bit to the end of chapter 1 here. What does Naomi say whenever she is returned back from Moab? She's faced with the townspeople, and her faith has hit a wall. What does she say? She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" I titled this slide On Rocky Ground. This is faith on very, very, very rocky ground. Naomi has some faith. She believes that God is a judge, but there's no mercy here. There is no grace. She does not see God's faithful love and kindness at the end of chapter 1. But now, the end of chapter 2, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose steadfast love and kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. By this simple revelation that Boaz is the one who has treated Ruth well, who has offered her protection, given her food, and again, she's clearly already pulling all of these threads together. She is now seeing, oh my gosh, the Lord has been at work. He has not abandoned me. I have not been forsaken. And just like that, her faith was restored. And it's interesting, too, take a look right here. Has not forsaken the living or the dead. Obviously, the living is, Ruth and Naomi. They're the ones who are alive. But the dead would be Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. Not Chilion as much, but especially Elimelech and Mahlon. Because, again, Naomi's putting together the pieces. She's anticipating and hoping that there is going to be a restoration of Ruth and therefore the line of Elimelech. And so there's going to be a reestablishment of that family, and they're not going to die and have nothing then. That family line would end, and that was, in the mind of the Hebrews, one of the worst things that could happen. And so Naomi is, again, she's sort of going on a stretch here, but we know that it, even though at first glance you may think, well, that's really a stretch, Naomi, you're really going out there, we know that it's not. So she's putting, again, all of those pieces together.
Do you think?
Questions?
do you
Yes.
think the first part, maybe that's another explanation for why she didn't, her bitterness and that God was against her. That's another reason she didn't just go say, hey, Boaz, here we are, whatever, the
Yeah.
other guy too.
Definitely.
Maybe she said, God's against me, so why should I present myself to?
Definitely. Yeah.
She also was seeing that she's being fed. She didn't have to worry about where her next meal was coming from.
Yep.
All those things are blessings, so, oh, the Lord is blessing us.
Yep. Definitely. So let's go ahead and move on then to the remaining 3 verses in the chapter. And Noel, I'm going to come back to what you guys were talking about before about the timing as well. But let's read verses 21 through 23. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Lots of really interesting things in these verses, so let's dive in at the very top. Ruth the Moabite. Notice that the author is again emphasizing that Ruth is, in her proper sense, a foreigner. In her proper sense, she does not belong in this family, in this culture, in this nation, to this God. And he's juxtaposing this, they're in juxtaposition, I can say that word, clearly not the verb form, with Ruth saying, hey, Boaz said to me, keep close, inviting her into this community. Naomi saying, daughter-in-law, daughter, again, my daughter, this identification. And then the verse just prior, what did she say? She said, Boaz, our near relative. Again, we see that the author's just saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to make an emphasis on Ruth's heritage, but saying this doesn't matter nearly as much as the fact that your heritage can be put to the side if you will transfer your allegiance to the one true God. And whenever you transfer that allegiance to the one true God, you are invited into the family, you are invited into the community, and you do belong, which is pretty cool. Next, I just want to point out, again, that there is repeated here young. I wouldn't personally make a big deal out of it, except that the author is clearly making a deal out of it, and that he's emphasizing some people are young, and it's not Boaz. So, again, this is going to come into play in chapter 3, and we are gonna take a look, not next week, but the week after, that Boaz is really honored by Ruth because there is an age difference, and to him it was significant. And so the author is building up this anticipation that there is an age difference here. Next, men to women. Why? What's going on? So remember that Boaz did hire both men and women to be working in his field, and this wasn't unusual, that they needed to work, and you could hire men and women. But this is the time of the judges. And although, again, we would hope that Boaz would do his best to get really good guys from, Israel, you can't guarantee. And so, Naomi's thinking, well, we know that Boaz is a good dude, but who knows about all the guys he has in the field. You know what, Ruth, just stay with the women, please. I just want you to be safe. So we see her concern for Ruth. We see that she really just wants her to be safe. And then we see that Ruth is humble and obedient. And Kelly mentioned this as well, that Ruth went ahead and said, okay, no problem. I'll go ahead and I will stick with the women. She's not trying to be defiant or anything. She says, no problem. I don't need to get assaulted today. That's fine. So she sticks with the women belonging to Boaz. Now, let's take a look here. Gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. I have to read this next section because it's it's too complicated for me to summarize inside my head. So the wheat harvest followed the barley harvest by about a month and a half. The Feast of Unleavened Bread happened in late March or early April, depending on the year. And so that started the barley harvest. And then after that, the Feast of First Fruits happened about 7 weeks later in late May or early June. And that was the end of the wheat harvest. So there were about, a month and a half to 2 months of working in the field, bringing in first the barley harvest, and then after that, the wheat harvest. So these are 2 separate harvests that are going on here. So notice again that Boaz didn't just say, oh, well, if you want to stop by the unemployment office sometime, maybe we'll have something for you to do, maybe not. He offers Ruth a long-time sub position, okay, essentially. So he says, hey, you can come, you're going to have security, you're going to have enough. And some commentators suggested that in those 2 months, Ruth could have gathered enough to last them a year or more, which to me is sort of staggering to the mind. But, this is a very different economy. And, they sort of had to, because there was the growing time, and then there was the harvesting time, and then there was the eating what you'd harvested time until the planting time, and then the next harvesting time, which was next year. So you had to make sure that you were going to be able to gather enough to last. So again, 1 year, some commentators suggested possibly even 2 years is what they would have been able to gather in this time. But again, we see here that the graciousness of Boaz is being emphasized, and that there is hope continuing in these verses, that it's not just oh, Boaz was nice to you, well, that's nice, but it's a hope for tomorrow, the day after, and the day after, that they're going to be able to survive and even thrive, because they don't have to worry about, well, will we be able to gather something tomorrow? So let's go ahead and take a look here. I want to show you guys, this is the end of Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. Naomi returned with the Moabite Ruth, and then we have Bethlehem, beginning of the barley harvest. And then again, we have Ruth and Naomi at the end of the barley harvest, and the 2 of them are together. And so this, along with, we talked about the beginning of chapter 2, we had Naomi and Ruth together in the house again. All of these things together form that inclusio, the 2 thoughts that mirror each other at the beginning and the end, that really tie off this whole section really nicely. So again, we have these whole chiastic, we have this whole chiastic structure pointing down to that center idea of Boaz praying protection and blessing over Ruth. If I was going to summarize chapter 2, which if you guys remember back to our very first lesson when we talked about inductive Bible studies, I said, hey, when you come to the end of a section, which we finally, after a month of hard work, we have finally come to the end of chapter 2. It's a good idea to step back and be able to try to summarize what's the main idea, what are the sort of main thoughts. These are mine. You may have slightly different ones or slightly different emphases. First of all, we see God showing his loyal, faithful love to Ruth and Naomi through Boaz's generous kindness and Ruth's humble, hardworking spirit. It wouldn't have happened with only one of those. The 2 of those together, again, we have this really interesting pairing of God's sovereignty and people working. Next, we have Boaz operating as the wings. He is the wings, all right? That parallels, again, Boaz is praying that for Ruth, but he is stepping into that role already. And guys, just wait till chapter 3. Just wait till chapter 3. It's so cool. So, it's great. I almost cried the other day whenever I made a connection. I was like, oh, Scripture's so beautiful. So, it's going to get really, really awesome. And finally, as Naomi herself finally recognizes God's faithful, loyal love to herself and to her family, and she rekindles her faith, we all, including Naomi, are anticipating that more is yet to come. And unfortunately, that's not tonight. That is next week and the week following. And we know the end of the story. But to talk about it, we have to wait. So our homework is going to be, again, I mentioned that I'm going to give you the piece of paper has both sections, both 1 through 9, and then on the back 10 through 18. So if you're the type of person who just wants to knock the entire thing out of the ballpark, get it done with, and then just focus on the book work, that's fine. Go for that. If you just want to do verses 1 through 9, because that's what we're going to be discussing next week, and then do verses 10 through 18 the week following, that's fine too. Or if you're like, Mariah, I will read those verses and then come. That's fine too. You know, these are, again, this is an opportunity. It's always an opportunity, never strictly homework. It's just a handy name to call it. And then in our Kelly Minter book, and we'll be starting session 4 and doing days 1 and 2.